previous lectures, we've looked at how children and teens perceive and process death, so it's only right that we then also take time to consider how adults view death. Much like how we started our discussion of children and grief, let's look at some images that reflect how adults conceptualize death. These are just a few to get us started. Look at each of these 4 graphics and tell me what you see. What are the positives and negatives of each picture? What might each imply in terms of fears, but also in terms of opportunities? How has death become more sterile, more removed, more medical and less part of everyday life? How important is it for people to have someone to companion them on their journey so they don't feel alone? What role in relationships exists between pain, fear, and tension? And finally, how much do we want to be able to control our own deaths, to decide when and where we'd like to die, instead of leaving that as an uncertain future? These are all things we'll look at in this week's lecture and reading. To pick up where we left off, adulthood is categorized into 3 main psychosocial stages according to Erik Erikson. Of course, we all know that the exact age may differ slightly, but Erikson reminds us that the developmentally appropriate motivations, crises, and goals for each stage in life will be different. Young adults are just experiencing independence and the desire to develop one's own identity, possibly start a family of their own. Adults, or middle adulthood as we often say, are really establishing their careers and raising families. Mature adults, or older adults, are trying to find ways to contribute to society, to still be part of the community, and they want to feel as though their life had value, meaning, and purpose. They want to leave their mark, to make a difference, or at least to feel as though they have done so. They're at the point where they look at their life and decide whether they were satisfied or if they have many regrets. This can impact the way they approach the end of life then as well. Depending upon one stage of development, he or she may view death differently. Young adults may think death is far off, and as such that they don't really need to think about it. Middle adulthood brings what we often refer to as the sandwich generation, because they may be caring for aging parents at the same time they're raising their own families. Older or mature adults usually realize that death is closer, and many either accept it or they fight it for all it's worth. Just look at all the things we do socially, emotionally, spiritually, even medically, to either prepare for aging and death or to resist and delay it. Even things, everything from wrinkle creams to Botox to brow lifts, we see it all. I'm not saying those things are all bad, they just aren't for me, or at least I say so now while I'm still in kind of early part of adulthood. My point is, and Erikson's point is, that we will view death differently based upon where we're at in life and what we're experiencing, either directly or through close friends and family members. In fact, there are many social and cultural factors that play a role. We had a similar slide when we talked about what influences children's perception of death, and some of these topics we were introduced to back in the first week of class. It's a good reminder for us, though, to realize that all of these things, that the sum of the experiences during one's lifetime influences the way that adults also are viewing death and are able to cope with loss. It's interesting how pop culture plays a role in what's seen as socially acceptable versus taboo, and that certainly impacts what people are comfortable showing or mourning after a loss. Certainly, adults are capable of processing cognitively what it means to die. They understand that we all die at some point, and that when you die, your body doesn't magically come back to life, and many people become frustrated or resigned to the fact that death is usually beyond our control. In some societies, that's not a big deal at all, but for Americans who are so independent and wanting to maintain control, this can be a very difficult thing to accept. For many, this desire to maintain control significantly impacts their quality of life, for better or for worse. One thing we've noticed is that over the past couple of generations, as we've seen death change socially and as medical advances continue, is that death has increasingly become something that we want to avoid or prolong, oftentimes at any cost. This relates back to our earlier discussion of the technological imperative, and this can be very difficult for patients and families to reconcile. Another way to look at death has to do with stepping back and considering our overall beliefs and views about the cycle of life and death. Here are 4 primary conceptions of death. As we talk about each, think about which makes the most sense to you personally. Which might others you know find more fitting for their own beliefs? The first perspective is ecological. In this framework, all forms of life and death are equal in importance. No one is better or worse, more or less important than another. This is more of a scientific view at its base. Everything lives must die, and there is no possibility of an afterlife. The second one, humanistic, is similar, but it sees human life as being more valuable than other elements of life. So humans are more valuable than plants, animals, and so forth. They see death as being the end of consciousness, and once the body dies, there is no capacity to think or feel anymore, and thus there is no afterlife. Rather, people would live on through the memories and impressions that they leave with others who have survived them. In the religious perspective, all forms of life are created and maintained through God or some higher power. There is belief in the possibility of an afterlife, in heaven or some similar place for life after death. Finally, reincarnation is the belief that the life cycle is continuous. When one form of life dies, it is reborn into a new form of life, and this pattern of death and rebirth continues forever. This is more common among Eastern religions, but we certainly see this among many people in America as well. So, as I stated earlier, which of these resonates more with you personally? What might other people you know believe that's different? Do you think this would make a difference in how you take care of your patients? Why or why not? We've talked already about how we've experienced a shift, a change in the social view of death. We've looked at how death and dying is seen as a taboo topic that should be avoided. We know that although death is biological and physiological as an event, that what leads up to death and what follows death is socially constructed. In other words, we learn what we should and should not do before the death occurs or after a death by observing and listening to the world around us, to the people in our lives, how the healthcare workers are acting, what the media says. All kinds of things are constantly sending us messages about what it means to be strong or weak, to have faith or to give up. Many times it's hard for people to sift through all these messages and to figure out for themselves what it is they really think, feel, and believe. This adds pressure to the grieving during a time that is already hard enough. Indeed, we're seeing shifts too in how people conceptualize death. What was once almost primarily a religious or spiritual experience is now being seen more as just a medical or a scientific event. We see people's uncertainty or discomfort with these topics exhibited in many different types of ways. Even looking at memorial services and funerals. When did we start changing from services that were to honor and remember with some sadness to services that are full of celebrations of life more than anything else? It's fascinating to think about these things and how one's culture influences what we do to commemorate the lives of those who have lived and died. As we consider this, we also want to look at whether it makes a difference if the death is expected or unexpected. Just as it's important to try to help prepare children and teens for an upcoming loss, it's also critical for adults to have a chance to prepare as well. But is that always possible? Of course not. So let's talk about it. Think to yourself, what would you consider to be an expected death? What types of situations might you expect someone to die? What about unexpected or a death that wasn't anticipated? What kinds of those deaths might be? Then think about what circumstances influence this. It may be things like depending upon the age of the person, their gender, their diagnosis or prognosis, resources they have available to them, the type and quality of medical care that they're able to access. How might you prepare differently if it were expected or unexpected? Do you think your ability to cope or the manner in which you grieve might be different based upon the type of loss? Does it matter if it was a peaceful death that was expected or unexpected, or if it were a violent or traumatic death that were unexpected? Certainly these factors play a role, and it's important that we acknowledge that, and then we don't have the same expectations for everyone. Each patient's needs and each family's needs will be different. Our job is to help understand this and provide the patient and family-centered care in a way that's congruent with their individual and their cultural beliefs. Many times people are afraid of death. This is nothing new or surprising to us. The question that's raised, though, is this: do people actually fear death itself? Or are they really more afraid of the physical and psychological processes that are associated with dying? We see 5 of the most common fears listed here on the slide, and we can see that they relate to either physical or emotional and social needs. Take a moment to read through these fears and to think about how these may be very real fears for the patients that you will be caring for, or maybe even for your own family members or yourself. Then think about what you can do to help lessen or alleviate those fears. What are little things that you can do that will make a big difference? Remember, our patients don't want us to give them advice or tell them how to feel. They need to be given permission to feel how they feel and have us simply accompany them on this process. You can look back at that companioning handout by Alan Wolfelt that I gave you recently, as this is a great place for us to remember that. And even though there's no magical age or point at which everyone suddenly becomes okay with death, we do tend to see that anxiety about death decreases as people age, but also depending upon how mature they are psychosocially. This is important to know, as each person will be at their own place with acknowledging death, either for themselves or others. I think it's interesting too, because as humans, we tend to assume that other people feel the same way that we do, right? I mean, we all do it. We do it all the time. We assume that people like the same type of food or movies, or maybe even political views as us, but that also often means that we assume people have the same fears about death that we do, and that's not always the case. As with any patient, try to find out what they're most concerned about and then help in any way you can. Don't assume everyone's the same. Nothing is more personal and intimate than being born and dying. So do your best to help them have the good death that they desire. You may want to die in a hospital, away from home, so you don't leave bad memories or spirits in the house, but someone else may want to die at home, surrounded by their family. You may worry about becoming a burden to others, but someone else may seek out and appreciate family's help and assistance because it fits within their social constructs and expectations for family. There's a lot of variety in life, and there's a lot of variety in death. These are just some common themes to get you started so you don't overlook something, but they're not a prescription for every person. This notion of having a good death or dying well really just means that we'd like to have some control over when we die or how death comes to us. How often have you heard someone ask or thought about how you'd like to die? We usually say, "Oh, I'd like to die in my sleep," or pain-free, or something along those lines. I don't think I've ever heard someone in all my years in grief work and long-term care say that they wanted to die in a fire, or by drowning, or murder. Of course we can't control everything, and certainly accidents happen, heart attacks and strokes happen, cancer and Alzheimer's happen. Dying well is our hope that even if those things occur, that we can maintain some dignity, hopefully not suffer tremendously, and that we can go out in the best way possible. Again, this may mean something entirely different to people of various cultures, regions, or religions, but this is something we're seeing become more prominent in America, where we tend to be more individualistic and like to maintain that control. So what can we do? If we're working with family members or patients, or we ourselves are faced with an impending death, there are things we can do. We'll have more on this in coming weeks, but for now, let's just think about some of the most obvious ways we can support people while giving them a sense of control again. We can involve them. Let them make choices and still be involved in living and dying. Encourage them to complete advanced directives, and then talk about that with others so you can try your best to uphold their wishes. You may want to refer them to other sources of support if they ask for it or if they need it. But be careful. Not everyone who is sick or dying needs a therapist. Not everybody who's dying wants to talk with a priest or rabbi. Let them lead you and guide you. Oftentimes, people just need you to sit and listen, to be with them, or again, to companion them on this journey of life and death. As we wrap up this part of lecture, let's watch Dr. Peter Saul talk about death in the 21st century. He hits upon many of these issues that we've been talking about, and it's interesting because he's advocating for a much more personalized approach to healthcare, even in his own experiences as an ICU physician. So let's watch.
Look, I had second thoughts really about whether I could talk about this to such a vital and alive audience as you guys. But then I remembered the quote from Gloria Steinem, which goes, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." So with that in mind, I'm going to set about trying to do those things here and talk about dying in the 21st century. Now, the first thing that will piss you off undoubtedly is that all of us are in fact going to die in the 21st century. There will be no exceptions to that. There are apparently about 1 in 8 of you who think you're immortal on surveys, but unfortunately this isn't going to happen. While I give this talk in the next 10 minutes, 100 million of my cells will die. And over the course of today, 2,000 of my brain cells will die and never come back. So you could argue that the dying process starts pretty early in the piece. Anyway, the second thing I want to say about dying in the 21st century, apart from it's going to happen to everybody, is it's shaping up to be a bit of a train wreck for most of us, unless we do something to try and reclaim this process from the rather inexorable trajectory that it's currently on. So there you go, that's the truth. No doubt that will piss you off, and now let's see whether we can set you free. I don't promise anything. Now, as you heard in the intro, I work in intensive care. And I think I've kind of lived through the heyday of intensive care. This has been a ride, man. This has been fantastic. We have machines that go ping. There's many of them up there. And we have some wizard technology, which I think has worked really well. And over the course of the time I've worked in intensive care, the death rate for males in Australia has halved. And intensive care has had something to do with that. Certainly a lot of the technologies that we use have got something to do with that. So we have had tremendous success. And we kind of got caught up in our own success quite a bit. And we started using expressions like life-saving. I really apologize to everybody for doing that, because obviously we don't. What we do is prolong people's lives and delay death and redirect death, but we can't, strictly speaking, save lives on any sort of permanent basis. And what's really happened over the period of time that I've been working in intensive care is that the people whose lives we started saving back in the 70s, 80s and 90s are now coming to die in the 21st century of diseases that we no longer have the answers to in quite the way we did then. So what's happening now is there's been a big shift in the way that people die, and most of what they're dying of now isn't as amenable to what we can do as what it used to be like when I was doing this in the 80s and 90s. So we kind of got a bit caught up with this, and we haven't really squared with you guys about what's really happening now, and it's about time we did. I kind of woke up to this bit in the late 90s when I met this guy. And this guy is called Jim Smith, and he looked like this. I was called down to the ward to see him. His is the little hand. I was called down the ward to see him by a respiratory physician. He said, look, there's a guy down here, he's got pneumonia, and he looks like he needs intensive care. His daughter's here, and she wants everything possible to be done, which is a familiar phrase to us. So I go down to the ward and see Jim, and his skin is translucent like this. You can see his bones through the skin. He's very, very thin, and he is indeed very sick with pneumonia, and he's too sick to talk to me. So I talk to his daughter, Kathleen, and I say to her, did you and Jim ever talk about what you would want done if he ended up in this kind of situation? And she looked at me and she said, no, of course not. I thought, okay, take this steady. And I got talking to her, and after a while she said to me, you know, we always thought there'd be time. Jim was 94. And I realized that something wasn't happening here. There wasn't this dialogue going on that I imagined was happening. So a group of us started doing survey work, and we looked at 4,500 nursing home residents in Newcastle, in the Newcastle area, and discovered that only 1 in 100 of them had a plan about what to do when their heart stopped beating. 1 in 100. And only 1 in 500 of them had a plan about what to do if they became seriously ill. And I realized, of course, this dialogue is definitely not occurring in the public at large. And I work in acute care. This is John Hunter Hospital. And I thought, surely we do better than that. So a colleague of mine from nursing called Lisa Shaw and I went through hundreds and hundreds of sets of notes in the medical records department, looking at whether there was any sign at all that anybody had any conversation about what might happen to them if the treatment they were receiving was unsuccessful to the point that they would die. And we didn't find a single record of any preference about goals, treatments, or outcomes from any of the sets of notes initiated by a doctor or by a patient. So we started to realize that we had a problem. And the problem is more serious because of this. What we know is that obviously we are all going to die, but how we die is actually really important. Obviously not just to us, but also to how that features in the lives of all the people who live on afterwards. How we die lives on in the minds of everybody who survives us. And the stress created in families by dying is enormous. And in fact, you get 7 times as much stress by dying in intensive care as by dying just about anywhere else. So dying in intensive care is not your top option if you've got a choice. And if that wasn't bad enough, of course, all of this is rapidly progressing towards the fact that many of you, in fact about 1 in 10 of you at this point, will die in intensive care. In the US, it's 1 in 5. In Miami, it's 3 out of 5 people die in intensive care. So this is the sort of momentum that we've got at the moment. The reason why this is all happening is due to this, and I do have to take you through what this is about. These are the 4 ways to go. So one of these will happen to all of us. The ones you may know most about are the ones that are becoming increasingly of historical interest. Sudden death. It's quite likely in an audience this size, this won't happen to anybody here. Sudden death has become very rare. The death of little Nell and Cordelia and all that sort of stuff just doesn't happen anymore. The dying process of those with terminal illness that we've just seen occurs to younger people. By the time you've reached 80, this is unlikely to happen to you. Only 1 in 10 people who are over 80 will die of cancer. The big growth industry are these. What you die of is increasing organ failure with your respiratory, cardiac, renal, whatever organs packing up. Each of these would be an admission to an acute care hospital, at the end of which, or at some point during which, somebody says enough is enough and we stop. And this one's the biggest growth industry of all, and at least 6 out of 10 of the people in this room will die this form, which is the dwindling of capacity with increasing frailty. And frailty is an inevitable part of aging, and increasing frailty is in fact the main thing that people die of now. And the last few years or last year of your life is spent with a great deal of disability, unfortunately. Enjoying it so far? Sorry, I just feel such a Cassandra here. What can I say that's positive? What's positive is that this is happening at very great age now. We are all, most of us, living to reach this point. You know, historically we didn't do that. This is what happens to you when you live to be a great age. And unfortunately, increasing longevity does mean more old age, not more youth. I'm sorry to say that. What we did anyway, look, what we did, we didn't just take this lying down at John Hunter Hospital and elsewhere. We've started a whole series of projects to try and look about whether we could, in fact, involve people much more in the way that things happen to them. But we realise, of course, that we are dealing with cultural issues. And this is, I love this Klimt painting, because the more you look at it, the more you kind of get the whole issue that's going on here, which is clearly the separation of death from the living and the fear. Like, if you actually look, there's one woman there who has her eyes open. She's the one he's looking at, and he's the one he's coming for. Can you see that? She looks terrified. It's an amazing picture. Anyway, we had a major cultural issue. Clearly people didn't want us to talk about death. Oh, we thought that. So with loads of funding from the federal government and the local health service, we introduced a thing at John Hunter called Respecting Patient Choices. We trained hundreds of people to go to the wards and talk to people about the fact that they would die and what would they prefer under those circumstances. They loved it. The families and the patients, they loved it. 98% of people really thought this just should be normal practice and that this is how things should work. And when they expressed wishes, all of those wishes came true, as it were. We were able to make that happen for them. But then when the funding ran out, we went back to look 6 months later, and everybody had stopped again. And nobody was having these conversations anymore. So that was really kind of heartbreaking for us, because we thought this was going to really take off. The cultural issue had reasserted itself. So here's the pitch. I think it's important that we don't just get on this freeway to ICU without thinking hard about whether or not that's where we all want to end up, particularly as we become older and increasingly frail, and ICU has less and less and less to offer us. There has to be a little side road off there for people who don't want to go on that track. And I have one small idea and one big idea about what could happen. And this is a small idea. The small idea is, let's all of us engage more with this in the way that Jason has illustrated. Why can't we have these kinds of conversations with our own elders and people who might be approaching this? There are a couple of things you can do. One of them is you can just ask this simple question. This question never fails. In the event that you became too sick to speak for yourself, who would you like to speak for you? That's a really important question to ask people, because giving people the control over who that is produces an amazing outcome. The second thing you can say is, have you spoken to that person about the things that are important to you, so that we can got a better idea of what it is we can do. So that's a little idea. The big idea, I think, is more political. I think we have to get onto this. I suggested we should have occupied death. My wife said, yeah, right, sit-ins in the mortuary, yeah, sure. So that one didn't really run, but I was very struck by this. Now, I'm an aging hippie. I don't think I look like that anymore, but I had two of my kids were born at home in the 80s, when home birth was a big thing. And we baby boomers are used to taking charge of the situation. So if you just replace all these words of birth, I like peace, love, natural death as an option. I do think we have to get political and start to reclaim this process from the medicalised model in which it's going. Now listen, that sounds like a pitch for euthanasia. I want to make it absolutely crystal clear to you all. I hate euthanasia. I think it's a sideshow. I don't think euthanasia matters. I actually think that that in places like Oregon, where you can have physician-assisted suicide, you take a poisonous dose of stuff. Only 0.5% of people ever do that. I'm more interested in what happens to the 99.5% of people who don't want to do that. I think most people don't want to be dead, but I do think most people want to have some control over how their dying process proceeds. So I'm an opponent of euthanasia, but I do think we have to give people back some control. It deprives euthanasia of its oxygen supply. I think we should be looking at stopping the want for euthanasia, not for making it illegal or legal or worrying about it at all. This is a quote from Dame Cicely Saunders, whom I met when I was a medical student. She founded the hospice movement. And she says, "You matter because you are, and you matter to the last moment of your life." And I firmly believe that that's the message that we have to carry forward. Thank you.
So what'd you think? What good points did he make? Did he share any opinions that you agree or disagree with? It's okay to have different viewpoints, and these are important things for us to think about. So we'll end on this note. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll take a break for right now.